Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk about the Arc Multicloud Connector. If I think of many companies today, they actually leverage multiple clouds. Now obviously we have Azure, but they may also be leveraging, for example, AWS. They may be leveraging GCP. And there are many others out there that customers may be leveraging. Now, if we think about that multi-cloud reality for the organizations, there are pain points associated with having resources in all these different clouds with their own control planes, their own systems. So if we think of the challenges, the changes around inventory. What do I have over my cloud estate in all of those different clouds? Now, there are paid solutions, but that's still often a challenge. I might think as part of that, reporting. So I want to know an inventory, but then run detailed reports and analysis on that. I think about management. I want to perform certain activities. Now, this could include a consistent way, for example, of tagging resources. I want to be able to apply those throughout all of those different areas. And eventually you may even get into, provisioning and other types of tasks I want to do. So when I think of all those different pain points, how can we start thinking about, obviously in this case, leveraging Azure to solve that problem? Now, if we consider one of the big things we have with Azure is the control plane. So in Azure, we have the idea of the Azure Resource Manager. And that's always leveraged for everything we do, any provisioning, be it the portal or DevOps, CLI, PowerShell, it doesn't matter. It's always going through the Azure Resource Manager. And it's in that Azure Resource Manager, we apply things like policy, we apply things like role-based access control. We have inventory capabilities. I can go and examine what I have, and I can also use the Azure Resource Graph to, at very large and very performantly, see what I have in all of my different environments that I may have there. There's extensions and a whole bunch of other things that I can bring to the resources via the Azure Resource Manager. And one of the things that Microsoft did is they introduced Arc. So what Arc did is it enabled me to extend that Azure control plane to other things. And primarily we think about Arc as bringing that to operating systems. It could bring it to Kubernetes clusters. And then on top of those, it could bring it to data services, dev services, AI services. And it gave us, yes, insight from the Azure Resource Manager into those things, but it will then also bring things like extensions to the operating systems, management of the Kubernetes clusters, ability to then deploy data services, dev services, AI services on top of that. So it was about taking the Azure capabilities and extending that to places that weren't in Azure. And so the natural progression of that is now what they're enabling via Arc is this idea of this multi-cloud connector. So if I think of, I've got my Arc system, what we're now doing is we're bringing it into other clouds. Now, today, that's focused on AWS. Other clouds will come over time. I think GCP will probably be the next one. Other clouds would probably depend on customer feedback on where they want to make those priorities. But with this, we have this new multi-cloud connector that facilitates this interaction. Now, the important point is it's just talking to the AWS API. It's not installing some appliance inside AWS. It's super lightweight. It's literally just making API calls. Now, because it's so lightweight, because it's just API calls, realize if I had something like AWS CloudWatch that looks at those API calls and you pay for that, that is obviously some additional calls. So you may consider that in your planning. but there's no agent. All it actually does is add to today custom IAM roles for the sets of capabilities that it is enabling. And we'll talk a lot more about that. So I think the best way to actually see this is we'll walk through this step by step. So if I was to jump over to the portal for a second. So I'm in Azure Arc, and I'm looking at this Multicloud Connectors that's in preview. And all we're going to do is go ahead and hit Create. Now, this Multicloud Connector is an Azure resource that's going to get created. So I do have to put it into a resource group, which is where it's also going to store all of the things it discovers. So I'm going to say RG AWS. I'm going to call it 32 because it's on my 32 account. And then I can give it a connector name. So I'm going to just call it AWS Connector 32. I'm going to create it in the East US region. And now notice here we have a choice. I can either select a single account or I can add an entire organization. So when I think about what's happening here, when I do this connection, I get the choice. I can connect to an entire organization and all of the accounts that would be underneath that. Or I can just go ahead and say, hey, a single account. And obviously I'd need permissions for whichever one of these I want to select. And so I drew this idea of, hey, this is the multi-cloud connector. But remember, what it's really doing is on the Azure side, we are going to go and install this inside a resource group. And it's going to create this multi-cloud connector resource, which then will have the various resources it's actually going to go and create once it starts going and seeing and doing the gets against what's actually in that cloud. So we get to pick this. Now, in this demo, we're just going to pick a single account. So if we jump back over again. So I'm going to say a single account. I'm going to enter in my account ID. Now notice we have two sets of capabilities here. It's saying as inventory and Arc onboarding. Now this is today. I expect this list will grow over time, but today we have two different solutions. And for the ones I want, I have to go ahead and hit add to make them available to this particular point. So I control which of these I want to do. Now, if I say add for the inventory, we have control. I can pick which of the various AWS services that I want to go and collect the data about. So it's going to go and collect the metadata about this. Now realize AWS introduced new things, new attributes maybe of those resources. There will be a delay in Azure picking that up. I think they sync the schema about once a month. AWS don't use API versions like Azure, so it makes it a little bit harder to detect what's changed. But I think it's roughly once a month, but that could change. The specifics of that will evolve over time. But there will be a little bit of lag. If there's a brand new type of resource or some brand new attributes of it, there'll be some lag between that. And then, so I have control of the types of services I want to collect, how often I want to poll it, and we'll come back to this, but by default, it's 1 hour, but I could go all the way up to 24. And I can also select, well, what regions I want to gather from. So I have a lot of control over exactly what I want to capture. And now you can see I could edit it or I could remove it. Likewise, we can onboard to Arc. So if I click add here, how is it connecting? Is it a public endpoint or proxy server? How often is it checking? So if I go and create some new resource, it could take up to an hour before, oh, okay, I need to go and onboard that to Arc. And again, what regions? Now, what's interesting here is I have to have a tag on the resource. It has to be called arc. The value doesn't matter, but the tag name has to be ARC. So the reason for this is the goal is to give you control. Now at GA, I think they're going to add some better control so you can pick what that is. But today, if I think about all the different resources that can exist, so I can have a whole stack of different resources over here. I might have S3 buckets. I might have network things. We have things we can enable for Arc later on. So EKS instances, EC2. And so the goal here is if I'm going to onboard to Arc, they want you to have control. Maybe you don't want to onboard everything to Arc. So this is basically a filter for that onboarding. So I have to go and today add a tag on the resource that has a name of Arc. It doesn't matter if it's a blank value or it says onboarding or true, not checked at all. In the future, the goal is they will let you configure and add filters to give you more granular control of which ones you want to go and onboard. So if we think about those capabilities for a second, so we have inventory. So I can say, yes, I want to enable inventory. Now, what this is going to do is on the Microsoft side, for every resource I have in AWS, it's going to create an Azure resource. Now, for most of those, it's going to be under this Microsoft.aws connector. And then it's going to be whatever the resource is. For example, that might be S3 buckets. Could be an example. And we can see that. So if we jump over and look. So if I look at the one I've already added and I look at the resources, all of these have been created under the resource group of this one I already added. But if I go and look at something, for example, like an S3 bucket, which we can see here, but notice it's got Lambda functions, IAM instance profiles. If I go and look at one of these, you can see the type is Microsoft.aws connector S3 buckets. And then we can see various properties about it. I can even see its tags. So it's copying those over from AWS into this resource that it's created on the Azure side. Now, the exception to this is for resources that I could enable for Arc in the future. So if I look at this EC2 instance, now what you're going to say is, well, no, that says Microsoft.aws connector EC2 instances as well. But if I looked at the JSON view of this resource, what we actually see it's doing is it's created initially under the Microsoft.hybrid compute, and then it's creating a stub object for if I enable it for Arc in the future, and then under that, it creates this extension where it's the AWS connector EC2 instance to store the actual information it's copying over from AWS. So the exception is, hey, normally it just creates this Azure side resource under Microsoft.aws connector resource provider. But if it is Arc supported, to really protect it for the future, in case I do Arc enable it in the future, it creates it initially under this stub object under hybrid compute, which it would then use when I Arc enable it. And then under that, it uses the standard Microsoft.aws connector. So don't worry if you see it, it looks slightly different for those resources that can be enabled. So if I think about my EC2 instances, my EKS, those can be onboarded to Arc. It does those a little bit different. But then we just go and see all of those resources in Azure, and we'll dive into some details a little bit later on and do a demo around that. And then obviously I have that choice to also enable it for Arc onboarding. but you have that control. So what I can do is apply that filter that at this moment in time in preview, I just have to have a key called arc. Doesn't matter what the value is. At GA, they're going to let you go and pick exactly what that should be. So you'll have a lot more control when that goes GA to see exactly what that does. But the whole point of what that then will do is for those resources that support being onboarded to Arc and then bringing the value of Arc. So today it's just EC2. Well, it will then extend that and also enable Arc on that. So then I'd get more detail of inside the operating system in the Azure control plane. I could then bring other Arc-enabled features into those types of resource in those other clouds. So it's really just bringing all of those different things together. So we'll go and install the Arc agent inside that particular operating system. I also have to add permission on the particular instances, and I'll actually walk through and show you that as we go through this complete thing. Now, how often do these update? And it's what you saw in both of those, I get the choice. So for both of them, I can select what that polling interval is, and I could say for between 1 and 24 hours. Or I don't have to have it sync. That sync was optional. I might just want to do a one and done. Now, the reason you may not want to poll every hour is, again, it's making those API requests. If I had a huge amount of objects and maybe there are certain quotas and throttles I have on the AWS API side, hey, I may not want to check every hour because of the amount of API calls it's making against that. And maybe I've got CloudWatch, which bills me for the API calls. So I may not want to do every hour. I may do every 6 hours or 12 hours, or it depends on how up to date I need those resources in Azure to actually be. Okay, so we select the services we want. How do I actually get this ready to be able to read from the Azure side? So we jump back over. After I go and select these services, I click Next. And what it's going to do is create an authentication template. So I'm going to download this template. So it's just downloaded this template.json. And if we actually looked at this, we can see all it's really doing, there's a bunch of parameters, but it's going and creating these two IAM roles. This Arc for server role. So that's so I can go and onboard it. And this Arc for server instance profile. These other things. So it's just creating these two IAM roles and this asset management role. And that's really it. That's all it's doing. And then it's creating the federation so that this particular connector can federate on the AWS side. So it's creating two IAM roles. And it's telling us, well, look, go to the CloudFormation stacks to deploy this. So if we now go over here on the AWS side, I'm going to create a stack. I've got an existing template. I'm going to upload it from my downloads. And there it is. I'm going to click Next. I'll give it a name. So this is my Arc onboarding 32. Everything else I can leave the same. I don't need to change anything at all. I don't have to change anything here. And just say, yes, I acknowledge, and submit. So this is now going through, and the way it's configuring what we need is it's using a stack. So I'm going through, and this is created during that onboarding, the stack file, and then it's just going through and creating those via a CloudFormation stack. So that is now going to go and create the roles, create the federation, so the connector can now go and get the required information it wants. So let's go and check in on that process. So create in process before I refresh. Okay, so it's still creating. We can see various events that are going through. Okay, now we can see it says create complete. Now this has created those roles we require. And I mentioned before that if I want to Arc enable resources, even though I've selected that option, I have to have that tag. So if I go and look at, for example, this instance, and I go and look at its tags, I have to have this value. Again, it doesn't have to be set to anything. But the other thing that I require is that custom IAM role I've added has to have permission on this particular instance. Now, I don't have to grant it at each instance level. I could absolutely go in and set it at the resource group level. I could set it at maybe the account or even the AWS organization, but I have to have this role applied. So let's apply it to these. I've got 2 VMs. So we'll apply it to both of them. So they've both now been configured with that IAM role. And as we saw, they both have the required tag of Arc that exists. So I've met the filter requirement that I configured, and I've given it the role so that the connector has the permission to do this. Now, what I'm going to do now is actually wait just a few minutes to give all that time needed to make sure it's propagated through. Typically, I'll give it about 5 minutes before I would now actually go and complete the next page of the Azure side, which is actually going to go ahead and create and start checking, hey, are the things there? So I don't want to have to wait an hour, which in my case is what I would do before that next poll happens, and it could go and get all the information. I want to try and keep this as short as possible. So we're going to wait about an hour before we go through and actually check the next page on our creation. If I can click next, if I wanted to add any particular tags, I can review all the different things I've selected, such as the types of services to add. Again, I've got that 1 hour periodic sync, but I could have changed that, all the different regions, and now hitting create will go ahead and actually leverage that federation we have created as part of that stack that we deploy to AWS, and also create those 2 roles. But I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes before I hit that button. So the 5 minutes has passed. I'm going to hit create. And now I can see that deployment is in progress. So we'll just let that complete. Now it says the deployment is complete. Now I can go to the resource group. Remember, this is where it's actually going to go ahead and create that connector. We always get a little bit of a lag when we do these things. But I'm going to jump back to Azure Arc. We'll look at our multi-cloud connectors. And then we can see my new one has been created. And we can see the status of both of those solutions. So we can see currently they are both pending because I've just literally created it. So it's going to take a little bit of time to fill that out. But what we will see is in the settings, I can modify those options. So under the solutions, I could go and I can see that periodic sync time. And notice I've got the edit option up here if I wanted to change any of them. And likewise for the Arc onboarding, I can see its settings as well. Also, I've got the authentication template that it created for me if I needed to go and re-get that for some reason. So we can see here the Arc onboarding has completed, but it's still pending for the inventory. And what will happen is, as it starts to discover those resources, they will show up in this resources area. Now, obviously, because it's still pending, there aren't any yet. So now that's just finished. So we can see the success. And now I would start to expect to see resources populating in here. And they're trickling. Remember, what it's doing is it's performing a get against the AWS API. It's getting the information about each of the resources. Then it's going to go ahead and create an equivalent resource on the Azure side for every single one of them. So we'll see a Microsoft AWS Connector / S3 buckets, and then a particular resource. We'll go and create a EC2 instance under that stub object for later on if and when it gets Arc onboarded. So it's going to take a little bit of time to trickle in for all of these different things. So let's jump back over. See if we've got anything showing yet. Yep, so we can see they're starting to come in. And I can see, hey, look, I've got some EC2 instances. I've got instance status. Now, the instance status is really there. It's got some additional information, typically for troubleshooting purposes. It's a bit more detail if there are any issues or event logs, but typically you're just not going to use that. When it's in a running state, I'm just going to look at the EC2 instance. But again, if I've got a stopped or an unknown, then that instance status may be useful to me. And if I just go and look at one of these, well, remember again, I could go and look at the tags, for example, and it has pulled those over as we saw them from the AWS control plane. So those are right there. I could, if I wanted to, go and add ARM tags. Now they're stored as different values, but I could optionally go and add some ARM tags if I wanted to do those. But I can see all the detail. I can see it's a Linux, Unix. I have that there. And again, if I look at the JSON view, because this is an EC2 instance, remember initially it's part of that hybrid compute. It doesn't really matter to you other than it's ready to be onboarded to Arc and it won't create a bunch of duplicate objects. And then under that, we have the actual AWS connector EC2 instances where it's storing this metadata for the resource. If we went and looked, see what else we've got. So we've got route tables, subnets. I've got an S3 bucket over here. We can see the detail about the S3 bucket as well. So it's bringing us an inventory of all of the different objects across it. Now the Arc onboarding, I did select that, remember, that's going to take a little bit longer. So if I actually go and look at my machines, we can see it started. So those are those two other ones, but they're not connected yet. If I go and look, server is not connected to Azure. So that's going to take a little bit of time to actually, that can take up to 15 minutes. But we've seen on my other ones from my other setup, that were also from that previous AWS connector, that now shows us connected. I get all the detail of the operating system. I can go and now add all the other capabilities that Arc brings. So it really has lit all of that up. Now, one of the things I talked about was, yes, the inventory side, and sure, I can easily go and see it just from looking at the resources. But remember, one of the great things about Azure is that Azure Resource Graph. And these will just show. So I'm looking at this page. I've got the link to this in the description below. But here I could go and query all of the multi-cloud asset inventory. So if I take this query from the documentation, and we'll jump over, and this time we'll just type in the resource graph. So I'm just going to paste in that query. Now this enables you to pick a specific subscription. So I'm going to take that out because I don't care. I'm going to take out this subscription check. And all it's doing is looking for anything that is AWS connector. And because remember those EC2 instances are treated a little bit differently, it just does a union for the type where it's AWS connector. But if I just run that, hey, it's going to now show all of that detail. And there's a bunch of other nice examples. All resources under a specific connector, any virtual machine, along with their instance size, be it in Azure or AWS. I think that's a really cool one. And that talks about the idea of, yes, we have this now unified inventory no matter where it is. So now I can see, yep, I've got my size. So I've got 2 in AWS and I've got 1 sitting in Azure. So it's showing me the cloud detail and the particular sizes over here. Remember, the schemas are different. So certain properties will have different names. So sometimes you may have to mix things. For example, here, the Azure tags and AWS tags, obviously they are stored differently. So I may just need to play around with my KQL a little bit to get the complete picture. But that's it. I mean, that's the whole goal of the solution. Step 1 is for AWS and bringing in inventory and enable you to onboard those machines into Arc very simply. Go forward, they're talking about adding other clouds in, and I'm sure we'll see other solutions as well. But as you saw, hey, I now have that ability to inquire about resources equally, be it they in Azure or AWS, and hey, really bring in additional information and then bring capabilities to it if it's Arc capable today, starting with the EC2. So that was it. I hope the video was useful. Until next one, take care.